my water just broke. I felt like things really intensified.
She was right there and she was coming.
It was an amazing feeling.
I'm gonna cry just thinking about it. I could feel her head.
We heard her cry. We were squeezing hands and she was screaming.
I'm Bryn Hunt-Palmer, and you're listening to The Birth Hour. This podcast is designed as a safe place for women to come together to share their childbirth stories. Stick around and join us to hear informative and empowering birth journeys from women all over the world. Today's guest is Barb Demske, who is a mom to 3 little boys and is going to be sharing those birth stories with us today. Her first birth was an unexpected and what ended up being a traumatic C-section, and after that she sought to have VBACs, vaginal births, after cesareans. She's going to share all of those stories with us today. Hi, Barbara. Welcome to the Birth Hour. Thank you so much for being here today to share your birth stories.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be on the show today.
Great. Well, let's start off by having you tell us a little bit about you and your family.
My name is Barb Demske. I live in Belleville, Michigan. I'm just outside of Ann Arbor. And I am married to my husband, Andrew. We've been married for about 5.5 years. We have 3 children, 3 boys. Liam, who is 4.5, almost 5. Nolan, who is 2. And then my youngest, Finn, he just turned 5 weeks old. I am a registered nurse, and I'm also working towards becoming a lactation consultant.
Cool. What type of nurse are you?
So I'm a pediatric nurse, and I work in a local university hospital. I'm currently on maternity leave, but I'm still trying to do my hours to become an IBCLC. So we're still busy, and it's much different the third time around with 2 other kids. It's a little crazy.
Interesting. I feel like I hear a lot that the third is like the easiest. Like the
That's
second is the
heard.
huge adjustment, and then the third's easy, but that hasn't been the case yet for you.
I don't know. I think it's always an adjustment. So I'm not quite sure. I just, the 2 young boys, my boys are just kind of wild.
Yeah. And you're still in like the throes of postpartum right now.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Still getting the hang of the new fam. Well, I know we're going to hear 3 birth stories today, so let's get started and go ahead and talk about that first birth. Maybe start with your pregnancy and what type of birth you were expecting to have or planning for.
When I got pregnant with my first, he was a honeymoon baby. So me and my husband had just gotten married, and the next month we found out we were pregnant, and it was very exciting. Not quite planned, but not planned, I guess you could say. We were just kind of leaving it up to fate. And so I got pregnant very quickly and pretty much didn't really have that much morning sickness. I felt pretty good. I think I was around 13 weeks pregnant, and I had some bleeding, and I went to have an ultrasound done, and I was found to have a subchorionic hematoma. And I think that's just where the placenta starts to break away just a little bit from the uterine wall, and it can cause some bleeding. For me, it didn't cause any major issues, and I kind of always knew the whole time that everything would be okay, and I wasn't worried. It's really strange to think, oh, you're bleeding. I know that they say that's normal, but I felt like at 13, 14 weeks, that probably, doesn't typically happen, but I just felt like I knew everything would be okay. Me and my husband had taken the Bradley method birth class. I was very into wanting a natural birth. We had watched The Business of Being Born like well before we were even married. I was obsessed with it, and I really just wanted to have a natural birth. And I believed that women could birth their babies. And it was just something that I really, really wanted to do. So I did yoga my whole pregnancy. I took this natural birthing class and just really was striving to have as natural of a birth as I could. I saw a group of midwives, and basically besides, just normal visits with them, my pregnancy was pretty uneventful.
So was it a midwife practice within a hospital?
Yeah, so it was a hospital practicing group of midwives. Some of them were, I think, more, holistic and natural in their approach, and some of them were pretty medicalized. At that point, I hadn't found the midwife that I had. She was probably in between the 2, I would say. She was, pretty medicalized, but also trusted in birth.
Okay. So how far along were you when you went into labor?
So I did not go into labor with him. His due date was March 27th, and that came and went. And I knew that, most women went past their due dates with, their first child. So I was expecting that, and it wasn't that big of a deal. Then 41 weeks came and went, and I started getting a lot of anxiety. I was walking, doing, all of the things that people tell you to do to induce labor. I had never really had any Braxton Hicks contractions, so I never really even felt what, people describe as Braxton Hicks. I felt like nothing was happening at all. At my 41-week appointment, I believe, is when we started talking about induction. And they said, well, at 42 weeks, we will induce you. And at that point, I had been getting some stress tests done just, to check on the baby. Someone had mentioned to me to try acupuncture. So it was like a last ditch effort right before my induction date. We did this labor inducing acupuncture session, which got a lot of things, like the baby started moving around like crazy. It was very interesting. I never thought that acupuncture that I would be able to feel things happening in my body. And I definitely did, but I did not go into labor from that. So at 42 weeks, actually, I was induced at 41 plus 5 was actually my induction date. And I went into the hospital, and they have you go in at night, and they give you Cervidil or some sort of like prostaglandin to help your cervix ripen. And so I did that, and it was at night, and they tell you to sleep. And I was, of course, up all night. You cannot sleep when you're about to have a baby. I could not, at least. So I was up all night. By the morning, I believe they were picking up some contractions on the monitor, although I wasn't really feeling them. And one of the nurses had come in and she said, "Are you feeling those contractions?" And I'm like, "No, I don't feel anything." So at that point was when the Pitocin induction was going to start. So they started the Pitocin. And basically, I was on the Pitocin. That was around 7 a.m., I believe. I was on the Pitocin all day. Nothing was really happening. The most that I progressed was probably to about a 3. I had been walking the hallways. I had been doing everything that they tell you to do in the hospital while you're being induced. Walking the hallways, in and out of the shower. I was like trying to just do something. So I think around 8 p.m. they came in, they said, "Well, you're not really progressing and we would like to break your water." And I think at this point, this was the second midwife that I had that day, or actually the third midwife since, my actual induction started with the Cervidil. So I consented to that. And as soon as they broke my water, I started having horrible pain. I thought that I had been like feeling some pain with contractions during the Pitocin earlier, but nothing compared to the pain that like instantly started as soon as they broke my water. So I really felt that I did not know how to cope. I was basically freaking out. I was pacing the room. I was in and out of the shower. I did not know what to do. And my husband is, bless him, as much as I love him, he was just kind of like, I don't know what to do either, because he never had seen me like that. So the nurse came in and she, was suggesting things that I could do. And I just said, I need an epidural. I remember I was standing in the shower and I looked at my husband and I just said, "This is the most painful thing I've ever felt in my entire life. And I cannot do this. I need an epidural." And he just said, "Okay, I believe you. And I think that you definitely should follow your instinct." So I did. So I got an epidural. And I think that was maybe like an hour after they broke my water. So pretty quick. And of course, I got the epidural and it was the most, amazing thing in the world. And I was able to sleep. And I just remember I couldn't believe that we had went from wanting this natural birth to me laying in bed with an epidural. And I was disappointed in that moment, but also just so relieved to just not be feeling the pain that I had been feeling. So I rested, and I think I rested on and off all night. The nurses and everyone were in and out, and I wasn't really having any cervical checks at this point, which was nice. So they came in around 7 a.m. So I think it had been about 8 hours since I had gotten the epidural and they broke my water. At that time, I had also been having some back pain. And I thought that maybe the epidural had stopped working because this back pain was just coming in waves. And it was very painful, but I wasn't sure if the epidural had stopped working, or is this like now my body like trying to, kick in and tell me that it's time to push. I like really couldn't put a finger on the sensations because I was pretty numb from my waist down. So they prepped the room for me to give birth, and I started to push, and I pushed probably for about 3 to 4 hours and nothing was happening. I pushed in every position possible. They had turned the epidural down so that I could, feel the contractions and feel myself, feel the baby, try to feel what I needed to feel to push the baby out. I couldn't feel anything. They had to tell me when I was having a contraction to be able to push, basically. So at that point, I just felt horrible. I was crying, and the midwife was not really doing anything to try to encourage me to get me in a better position, to help encourage me that I could do it. And I just really felt like I was failing. I felt like something was wrong. Like, why couldn't I push my baby out? So after around 4 hours, I decided that I needed a rest, and I just was begging them. I'm like, I can't do this. I need a break. So they said it was okay for me to try to rest, and they like upped my epidural, and I was able to sleep for about an hour. And I woke up feeling, it's strange to say, but I felt like a new person, that I got an hour of sleep, and I was all psyched out. I'm like, okay, I can do this. My husband was right there. He was encouraging me, and we were just ready. I was like ready to meet my baby. And we also did not know the sex of our son at the time. So we were just, really excited. And so I started pushing again, and they turned the epidural all the way back down, and I still like could not feel anything. They started mentioning things. Well, maybe we can pull in the ultrasound and like see what's going on down there. No one had mentioned that the baby might be posterior, which he had been. They were thinking about maybe trying to do some sort of like vacuum assisted birth if they could, but he wasn't even descended really through my pelvis at that point when they had checked his position with the ultrasound. And I, at that point, also had started to spike a fever. I was feeling horrible. And I told them, I said, something is not right. I am feeling very sick. And they were just, I don't know how long they would have just let me keep going with this pushing. But I, at that point, after 7 hours of pushing, I was begging them for a C-section. And it was the one thing that I did not want to happen. And I was just in tears. And I was asking for the exact thing that I didn't want to happen, and I didn't know what to do. So they said, okay, I think with your fever, I think it's time. So it was a non-emergent C-section, and the baby had been doing fine the entire time. And the one thing I had asked, I said, can you please not tell us the sex? Can you let my husband announce the sex, like when we find out? And that was like the one thing that I just, really wanted to have happen once we were going to have the C-section. So we went down for the C-section, and I was so exhausted at that point. I don't even know how I was still awake. It had been 2 days, basically. I think I was on Pitocin for a total of about 36 hours by this point. I had went in on a Friday night, and now it was Sunday evening. So we were at like 48 hours of this, and I had gotten, barely any sleep. I was in the operating room, and I just remember they were telling me, you might feel like there is a lot of pressure on your chest, like you can't breathe. And they were telling me all of these things. And I thought that, and I literally felt like I was going to die. It was very, very scary for me. I was shaking, like they had my arm strapped down, and I was just shaking uncontrollably. I was throwing up, which is extremely hard to do when you're lying flat on your back. I remember the anesthesiologist was just holding a little emesis basin for me, but I was throwing up while they were delivering my baby. And they were able to they're pretty quick, especially since I already had the epidural. So he was born, pretty quickly after I, had been wheeled back there. And he was born, and they took him over to the heat lamp immediately. So I didn't see him. So they didn't show him to me right away. And I remember my husband going over there, and he announced that it was a boy, and I heard him screaming, and it was so amazing, but I felt so horrible that it was so difficult for me to even process that, we had just had the baby. So I did see him, and he was beautiful. And, that was pretty amazing, because I had to have because I had a fever, I had to have, the baby had to have antibiotics. So they took the baby right away, and I made my husband go with the baby, and they took him to go get IV so that he could get antibiotics. So he and the baby had left the operating room at that point. And then I proceeded to have trouble, my uterus clamping down or going back down. And so I had a lot of bleeding and lost a lot of blood after that in the OR. And I was there for quite a while they had to do some blood transfusions and some fluid resuscitation. And I remember feeling like they had put oxygen on me. And I just remember feeling like, oh my gosh, if I fall asleep, because that's all I wanted to do, I felt like that I was going to die. That's like how much this feeling of dread had come over me. So I forced myself to stay awake, which is crazy to think that you can do that in that kind of moment. But I did. I was like, I'm not falling asleep. I have to stay awake. And I did. And everything was okay.
And you've been awake for like 2 days, basically.
Yeah. 48 hours. Well, then the whole day before that, really, the Friday before we went in, I didn't really nap that day. So yeah, longer. I was just exhausted. And my husband was very worried because he had left the OR at this time and he didn't know what was going on. By the time I made it back to the room, everybody was stable, and I was just so happy to be with my baby. And I was like, I need to nurse my baby right now. And I couldn't. I was in, a little bit of pain, but still pretty numb. So I was able to move a bit, and the nurse helped me get the baby latched on. And I remember the baby didn't latch really, and she had to help me hand express some colostrum, but I was able to do that. And that was the one thing after that birth that I really held on to, was really trying to preserve and focus on my breastfeeding relationship with him.
And did that end up going okay?
We had some hiccups definitely in the beginning, but we breastfed successfully for over 2 years. So that was, a pretty amazing experience for me.
I feel like it's important to just say that everyone has hiccups in the beginning. Yes. I don't know anyone who's just like, it was a beautiful, perfect, baby goat relationship from the beginning, Right. But if you can make it through that hard stuff in the beginning, you can do it for a really long time, if that's what you want.
Well, that's exactly why I'm so passionate now, and why I'm becoming a consultant, is because of that experience as well. But yeah, I mean, it can be tough in the beginning. After I got home with him, my physical recovery was just really hard. I just had a really hard time. I felt like I couldn't do anything for a really long time. I remember thinking almost immediately after he was born, like I was planning my VBAC in my head, and that I wanted to do it over. I was really traumatized by the whole experience, and I was constantly reliving that and thinking about what had went wrong. And I cried probably whenever I could cry now probably, but I could cry about it like for over a year, talking with other people about that birth. And a lot of people didn't understand, but I had a lot of, healing to do from that birth.
Yeah, I can imagine having it be something you didn't want, but also having it be something you asked for versus an emergency situation where you can kind of, blame the circumstances or whatever. And I could just see all the things that would go on in my head as far as dealing with the decisions you made versus what actually happened and all that stuff.
Exactly. That's exactly it. I just didn't know how to process that.
Mm-hmm. So were you able to find help for that, or was it really just you needed the VBAC experience to fully heal?
I think I needed the VBAC experience, but I also didn't really know that it had been so traumatizing to me until I was actually pregnant with my second son.
Yeah, I heard that a lot.
Yeah, all the feelings came back up during his pregnancy, I think. So after that birth, we didn't get pregnant. I think my son was 2. Liam was 2. And we had been trying for about 4 months to get pregnant. And at that point, I was just so unsure. I didn't know, should I go to an OB now? I had a C-section. Should I see my midwife again? I didn't fully trust the midwife practice. And I was just really lost when it came to finding a provider. I had done a consult with an OB, and immediately there were red flags about whether or not she believed in VBACs and, supported the VBACs. She said she supported them, but then was saying things like, oh, but sometimes you never know. Babies just don't come out, or they're just so big and your pelvis might not be big enough. So I immediately knew. I was like, okay, well, I'm not coming back to see you again. Thank you. So I went back to the same midwife practice and found a different midwife that I, really liked and actually became really close with her over the next couple of years. I saw a therapist to work through the birth trauma. And that for me was such a great experience because it was really what I needed to learn how to trust my body. So throughout this pregnancy, I really focused on the work that I needed to do to be able to trust my body. So in the therapy, we did a lot of work we did birth art, and it was actually a pretty cool experience. And I felt at the end of it, I felt like I was on the road to recovery and that I could have this VBAC and that it was going to be amazing is what my whole mindset was.
Can you talk a little bit more about the birth art and details there? I feel like people are like, wait, what?
Right. I'm not an artist, but my therapist said that a lot of women, they do this an art project where they have feelings come up about their birth, and they do this guided imagery exercise with you, and they just have you draw what is coming to your mind during the experience. And so I don't know that it actually it didn't bring up feelings about the birth specifically for me, but it actually brought up some thoughts about my dad, who had passed away some number of years before, and how I was mourning the fact that he wasn't here to meet any of his grandkids. And I could go on about that, but it was a healing experience in ways that I really didn't expect. And I think it helped me just learn to trust that life is just unexpected, and everything is not going to be perfect, and learning to just kind of relinquish those expectations. And that was really healing for me. So I was also in pretty good shape physically. I had only gained 10 pounds through that pregnancy. I hired a doula, which was probably the best decision that I made for that delivery. And I just knew that for this delivery specifically, that I needed to let my body go into labor on its own, and that I didn't want to receive any pain meds because I just really wanted to feel what my body was doing. I felt like I needed that experience to be able to push the baby out and have the baby. So towards the end of my pregnancy, I was doing just a ton of encouragement to help with positioning, spinning babies, exercises. I started to get acupuncture probably around 36 weeks just to help with positioning and cervical ripening. I did Moxibustion, which typically is known for like turning breech babies, but can also be helpful with helping the baby get in a good position and with cervical ripening. So I was doing that. I was having lots of sex. I was walking. I had a couple of close friends that were like my cheerleaders, and they were, talking with me every day. They're like, let's go walk together. We're going to do squats. I was doing like 1,000,000 squats. I was sitting on the birth ball. I mean, anyone that someone told me would help, I was doing. So I was taking a lot of baths, warm baths at night to help with relaxation with Epsom salts. And I had a mantra that I would say over in my head that I needed to trust in my body, to do what it knows, to trust in myself, to relax and let go. And that was helping me so that I could surrender to my body. So I really was in this like mental mind game that I needed to trust my body. Around 40 weeks came and went again. And right at 41 weeks, I wasn't feeling too much anxiety until right before 41 weeks. And I think that's when I had some anxiety with my first son. So I went to my 41-week appointment, and I hadn't been getting cervical checks at that point either. So at 41 weeks, I did get a cervical check, and she said, well, I think that I can stretch your membranes, do a membrane strip. And she just knew that was going to work for me. And I don't know how, but she was pretty confident.
Yeah, it's kind of unusual to make
I
that kind
know.
of statement.
That's what I thought. And I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking, this, I was like praying that she was right. So,
Right.
so that was in the morning, and I had went to the mall. I had met a friend to have lunch, and we did like laps around the mall. I was walking. This was in November, so it was pretty cold here in Michigan. And so I couldn't walk outside for very long. So I was walking in the mall, and I had started having some contractions. They weren't painful, but I was like, oh, I think something's going on, but they weren't anything that I was paying that much attention to. Like, they weren't timeable. They were just kind of happening randomly. And so I came home, I took a nap with my son, had dinner, and, woke up, had dinner, did our normal routine. My husband was he had class that night, so he was not home. And as soon as my husband got home, I said, I think we're going to have a baby tonight. And I just felt like things were happening. I definitely was having contractions. Again, they were not painful though. They were just, noticeable. And I got in a bath, like that had been my normal routine for the evenings. And my husband was actually in the bathroom with me. We were just kind of talking about, if this was going to happen tonight. And, we were just really excited, and we were just talking about how we imagined that it might go. And so I got out of the bath, and as soon as I got out of the bath, it was like, I have to go to the bathroom. So I sat down on the toilet, and I lost probably my entire mucus plug. I'd never seen anything like it. And I was like, oh my gosh, it was kind of crazy. And there was definitely like bloody, show. And I was like, well, I think this is definitely happening. So we were pretty excited. And almost instantly, though, I was having back-to-back contractions, like extremely, extremely painful. And I had been kind of talking to my doula all night, like talking on the phone, and then like, texting back and forth, like, oh, this, I think things are happening tonight. And so that was at 10 p.m. And things progressed pretty quickly from there. The contractions were never really regular. They were kind of like 2 minutes apart, 5 minutes apart. At some point, we weren't even timing them because like we couldn't even keep up with the time. I don't know how people time contractions because they just seemed like they were so close together. I didn't even know how to do it. And my doula, I said, I think you need to come over because this is, really difficult. And she was like, well, try and rest. And I got in the shower just to see if that would help. And she was like, just go to bed like normal and try to rest. And I was like, I think this is happening soon. And she said, okay, I'll come over. We had called our midwives at that point, and this was the same like hospital-based midwife. So it wasn't my midwife that was on call. It was another midwife. And she said, they seem like they are not very consistent because they were not exactly spaced out. I don't know how they like them to be like exactly 5 minutes apart, but they were pretty strong. So my doula came over and she could quickly see that I was in very active labor. I was trying to rest over my birth ball between contractions. And then I was, still trying to go into my room and, lay down and rest because we didn't know like how long this was going to, go on for. And that was probably around 11:30-ish, I think, just like an hour and a half after. So this all happened very quickly. I was starting to make like these animal noises that I like never even knew could come out of me. I never knew that I was going to be like a loud laborer, but I was very loud in labor. And I had thought, I'm like, when should we go to the hospital? Because I feel like this is like pretty intense. And I remember my doula saying, let's just try to stay home a little longer. I know you really wanted to stay home as long as possible, which I felt had been important so that I didn't go in too early to the hospital. And my husband was like, no, I think we need to go right now. So we did. And that was the worst car ride of my entire life. I couldn't even have imagined that, driving in a car during active labor like that would be so hard. And I remember just driving and I was like, I do not know if I can do this. And I started just feeling, so much doubt, even after all my preparation. I was feeling very doubtful. And he was doing such a good job of encouraging me. He said, this is what we've worked for so hard. You're doing so amazing. And just hang on and you can do it. And he was so amazing during that car ride. We got to the hospital and they had already, because we had talked on the phone with them, so they had already had a room for us. And we got into the room right away and they were filling the tub. And I got in the tub right away, I think. And she checked me while I was in the tub because I needed some sort of relief right away. And so I got in the tub and I actually don't remember how far dilated I was at that point. But they were like, okay, this is, happening pretty quickly. And so they wanted to get an IV started just because I had the hemorrhaging with the last birth. And, so I allowed that. It was very difficult for them to get the IV access at that point, just because I was in such active labor that they were, having to deal with that. And my doula was really encouraging me to do these like low moaning and trying to really sit into the contractions. And I just remember sitting in like the squatting position in the tub and just really letting my body do what it needed to do. And the tub was amazing for, helping me with my pain. I felt like it was so relieving for me. Really quickly after I got in the tub, I started grunting and started pushing, and I wasn't even, it was my body doing it. Like I felt like a passenger in my body. I that's the only way that I could describe it, is that my body was just taking over and, doing what it needed to do.
What position were you in the tub?
So I went back and forth from all fours to then kind of like just on my knees, like squatting into does that make sense?
Yeah, like were you holding onto the edge of the tub?
Yeah, just like really sitting into it while the contractions were coming and while my body was pushing.
I remember with my, like getting in the tub with my birth, like that just feeling of being able to just kind of sink into it finally without all the weight of everything else on you in addition to contractions. It was such a nice relief.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I think that's what helped me like progressed so quickly to being able to push was getting in the tub.
Mm-hmm.
And my body was just doing it. And they were like, okay, I think she's pushing. And I hear everyone out there like wrestling about. And so I had pushed in the tub for quite a while. And I pushed for about 2 hours with him. And I actually got out of the tub. I think at that time they at the hospital did not allow water births. So I actually got out of the tub and I got onto the bed onto my side. And I remember just feeling like, oh, this baby's not coming out. I was like going on, an hour and a half of pushing and I'm like, what is going on? Why can't I push this baby out? And I remember them saying like, oh, you're doing a great job and the baby's coming. And I'm like, okay. They had me, I was on my side. And then all of a sudden in this one big movement, I felt my baby just fully descend all the way through the birth canal. And it was the strangest feeling and the most amazing feeling because all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, this is happening and I can do this. And I just knew that the baby was going to come out.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was the strangest feeling. So then I actually flipped over on my back at that point and I pushed the baby out. He came out. It was another boy and my water had not broken at all to that point. So I think they broke the water like as the head was coming out. And I had pretty amazing pictures, actually. He was born. He had the caul over his head. Mm-hmm. And they put him right on my chest. It was just amazing. And I remember looking over to my husband, and my doula had been taking pictures for us. And we were just like, I was like, I did it. And I was just crying. And it was the most amazing experience. I actually didn't see my son being born. Like, I didn't see the caul. I didn't even know it happened. I had seen it in a picture after, and my doula had told me. No one had really even talked about it. I guess they had to pull it off his head pretty quickly. It was just really amazing. And then I should go back a little bit. When he was coming out, he had his shoulder had gotten stuck. So they actually called him a shoulder dystocia. Even though they quickly got him out, there wasn't really any complications with that. So they did cut the cord right away, which I did, I'd wanted to have the delayed cord clamping, but that didn't happen with him. Shortly after his birth, my placenta did not detach. So they ended up having to do a manual extraction of my placenta, which was extremely painful. And then I started to bleed. So I had another postpartum hemorrhage with him, which ended up, sadly, I had ended up having to go into the OR and have a DNC. And so that was pretty upsetting.
Can you explain like what that entails for people who don't know?
Right. So when they manually detached my placenta, so they literally, pulled the placenta out of my uterus. They used their hand to kind of like
scrape your uterine walls.
Right. To like peel it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so they must not have gotten all of the placenta. So at that point, I started having some like low blood pressure and I was pretty symptomatic and not feeling very well. So I ended up having to go to the OR where they basically scrape your uterus to get all of the product out.
And they do that through your vaginal opening. It's not like you had to be cut open.
They did not cut me open. I did, however, have to have a spinal anesthesia.
That's very good that you did at that point.
Right. But it was so like disheartening because I was like, I just did that without any pain medication. And now I have to have a spinal? Like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
So I was actually really, despite the bleeding and going to the OR, I was really able to separate the two almost like they were two different events because I felt like the birth was so beautiful and then that happened. So I did not have as much of, I didn't feel traumatized at all by that experience. Got more blood. I did receive blood transfusions and breastfeeding went really good after. And, things were really good after, even though I had to have, the DNC. I felt a million times better after having the vaginal delivery than after my C-section. I can't even describe it. It was night and day. I felt so transformed by this experience, and I just gained a confidence in myself that I just never knew that I had. And I was like telling everybody about this birth experience, and I was just riding what some people call this like birth high for like weeks and weeks and weeks. I was so happy that I was able to have a VBAC with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to share it with everybody. And I became a huge advocate, I think, at that point, just for VBACs and just really, informing other people. So after that, I got pregnant with my youngest son now, Finn, when my other son was only 16 months old. And I was not ready to be pregnant again. It was a surprise, and it was very emotional for me because I was not ready. My baby was still my baby. And I had done a lot of thinking about home birth after my last experience. And it sounds crazy because I had the bleeding issues, but I just felt I believed so much in like the birth and the birth process at that point that I felt that the reasons that I bled were basically medically because of medical interventions. So I had seen a group of home birth midwives I was, considering going with, but I just didn't know. Like, I just couldn't make a decision. I was very worried, especially after my issues with the bleeding. And so we decided that I was not going to do a home birth. We went back to the same midwife that we had been seeing before. I should add that with the last pregnancy with my second son, I had something that was found in my blood called the anti-E antibody. I don't know if you've ever heard of like the blood incompatibilities.
No, I mean, I guess the only thing I can think of is like the ROGAM test. Is that the same thing?
It's similar. It's just a different antibody, basically.
Okay.
But it was non-detected through my whole second pregnancy. But at birth, they detected this antibody. And it basically just puts the baby at risk for hemolytic disease of the newborn or jaundice, really bad jaundice. And there's a whole slew of other complications. But because I had this antibody, and it was most likely I got it from one of the transfusions that I had with my first son.
Could it have contributed at all to the bleeding with the second one, or is that unrelated?
They tell me that it's unrelated.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody really knows, but because of this, it was also one of the reasons that I decided to go back to the midwife practice because of their knowledge with, the antibodies and that sort of thing. Because just in case my antibody levels rose throughout the pregnancy, there's some other complications that could happen. But I actually they were undetected the whole pregnancy until I went into labor until I was at the end of my pregnancy. So that all really was like not really an issue for my third pregnancy. So we hired a doula. We hired a different doula this time around. I found someone that I just connected better with. And I did basically everything the same this pregnancy, especially towards the end. It worked the first time, and I was like, it needs to work the second time. So I was pretty much, feeling really good about this birth, and I knew that I could trust my body this time around. I had felt like the baby was in like a funny position, like maybe posterior, but I wasn't quite sure. And every time the midwife had palpated my abdomen, she was like, well, he could be posterior, but I think that he's, in a good position, but he might be flipping back and forth, which was what she had thought maybe. I had tried to do the belly mapping, but I'm not very good at that either. So we did all the same things to encourage labor, and my 40 weeks came and went. And at that point, we weren't really even talking. I think I did get checked at 40 weeks. And I don't know why I got checked because I know that, the cervical dilation and the effacement, it doesn't really predict when you're going to go into labor. And I knew that. But it was like, I need to do something. So let me just get checked. And she said, well, you're about a fingertip dilated. And I think I was 50% effaced. And I was just like, I felt so discouraged from that. And I was just kicking myself because I knew I should not have done it. And I cried the whole way home. I was just feeling like I was, of course, never going to go into labor. And I was just at 40 weeks. I think I had been convinced that I was going to go into labor early just because I had, had 2 babies already. I was pretty upset that day. And over the next few days, I was just really trying to enjoy my 2 my 2 other sons, and really trying to enjoy the last days of pregnancy. But it was really, really hard emotionally. I go back to this place where I feel like I'm not, my body is just not going to go into labor. I think that those feelings rise up right at the end of pregnancy, especially since with my first, I never went into labor naturally. They just came back up. So I was 40 plus 5, so 40 weeks, well, actually 40 weeks and 4 days. And then in the middle of the night, I had gotten up to go to the bathroom and went back up to my bed. And I remember thinking, I'm so exhausted. I'm so happy that I get to lay down and go back to sleep. And the second I laid my head on the pillow, I felt this huge gush. And I'm like, oh my God, I did not, I'm like, I think that's my water. And then I had another gush. And I did not expect my water to break to start labor because it had never happened before. And most people say that's not usually how labor starts. So I called my husband. My husband was actually downstairs sleeping with my 4-year-old because he always gets up in the middle of the night still, and it's easier for my husband just to go in bed with him. So I ended up actually calling my husband on his cell phone, praying that he would answer, because I did not want to move, because I knew the second that I turned over in bed, the floodgates would open. So I had my husband come upstairs. He did answer the phone. He came upstairs and helped me get out of bed. And then, of course, I had a lot of fluid come out. I was able to go downstairs and just kind of sit on the toilet for a while. And this was at 4 a.m. So I decided that I was just going to try and sleep because I was not having any contractions at all. I was just feeling like, this is going to happen today, obviously. And just really trying to rest was on my main priority, because at this point I'm thinking that my labor could be really long, because this is not how my last labor started, especially because I wasn't having any contractions. So I laid on the couch probably for, about an hour. My husband went back to sleep, and then we woke up and around probably 7. I actually didn't go back to sleep, but I think so the water broke at 4, and then I think around 6 a.m. was my first contraction. And they were not anything too extreme. They weren't really painful. I just noticed them, just kind of like how it started with my second son with the contractions. And my mom was coming over to watch my other 2 boys. So we had called her, had her come over, and I didn't want to call the midwife yet, or the hospital, because I knew that the second I called that I would probably be put on this clock, and they probably would want me to come in just to be checked out. And I did not want to go in just to come back home, especially because it had just snowed. So, and we're about 25 minutes away from the hospital. And I had my 2 other kids, and I was like, I'm not going to the hospital and coming home. So I knew that I just wanted to stay home for a little while, especially if things were not going to go quick. So my mom got there. I had a friend that was coming over to pick up my other son to take him to a science class, and that was around 9 a.m. So I was able all morning to kind of do things around the house, kind of get ready. My husband was clearing the snow out of the driveway and, just doing those last minute things to get ready to go. And around 9:30, I was standing at my bathroom sink, it was swaying back and forth, and feeling okay, things are starting to happen. This is starting to get a little bit more intense. I sat down on the couch with my mom. She was sitting next to me, and I had a contraction that just was super intense and super long. And I was squeezing my mom's hand, and towards the end of it, I just started crying, and I was like, this is what it feels like. Like I remembered what labor was like, and I was just, you forget almost exactly what it feels like until you're in labor again. And so I was squeezing her hand, and I started crying, and she was trying to comfort me as, best as she could. And my husband came in the house, and he said, I think it's time to go. He could see that I was really struggling and that things were picking up pretty quickly. So we had called the midwife on the way to the hospital. And again, as soon as I got in the car, things just intensified immensely. I started to do my moaning, the same kind of like animalistic groaning sounds that I had made through the last labor. And I knew that this was going to be happening soon. So throughout the car ride, I think we had told our doula, like, just meet us at the hospital. And we had called the hospital to let them know that we were definitely coming in right now. And by the time I got to the hospital and checked into triage, they took me back to a triage room. And that was at 10:30 to 10:45. My doula arrived, and right when she got there, I was having probably the most intense, contraction that I had had up until that point. I was sitting on the toilet, and they were like back to back to back, just so close together. And I was just not getting a break at all. I was having trouble coping. And she came up to me, and she like put her hands on my head and just kind of leaned in almost, as if like maybe she was going to pray with me. I felt this energy from her that just like instantly relaxed me. And I was able to just kind of like get with the program, I guess, so to speak, and, say, okay, let's calm down a little bit. Because at that point I was like kind of doing the same thing that I did with my first son. Like I was just like pacing back and forth. Like I felt so out of control with my body, and I was having a really difficult time. I was finally able to get onto the stretcher for them to check me, because they really needed to check me, which was, a little bit frustrating, because I just, felt like, okay, this is clearly happening. Can we just get to a room first? Was my original feeling. So I was able to sit down on the bed, or lay down on the bed, and they checked me, and I was at a 6. And as soon as they got me to a wheelchair and they pushed me to my room, the tub was already being filled for me, thankfully. And as soon as I got into the room, it was probably not even like 5 minutes later, I was starting to push. And I was pushing in the wheelchair, basically. And they were like, whoa, okay, this is really progressing. So they helped me get into the bathtub. And again, like just like my last birth, that was incredibly soothing for me. And the pushing this time just felt so, like it didn't really hurt. It just felt good that I was like able to do something. I was able now to like work with my body instead of just like working through the contractions. And they came in and checked me at that point in the tub to make sure that I was ready to push, but my body was pretty much doing it regardless. They were like, okay, yep, you're pushing and the baby's coming. So they had started to wheel in the delivery cart, because they had thought that, well, we're just going to do a water birth. And at that point, outside of the room, things were kind of like scrambling around. I don't think they really like it when women come in to the hospital like with such a quick birth, because they can't do all the things that they need to do in the hospital. But they were like, is there anything we need to know? And I'm like, yes, I had, bleeding with both of my kids. And so they were trying to start an IV as well at the same time, which they did. They got that. And then they wheeled the delivery cart in there. And I was just working, feeling like a lot of pressure and just a lot just like the baby was coming. And I was able through that though to say I can't deliver in the tub because my son was a shoulder dystocia, my last son, and I was worried about if he were to get stuck. So they were able to help me get out of the tub. And so I walked over to the bed, got on the bed, and the bed was kind of raised almost all the way up. And I was able to like hang over the back of the bed and really just sit and squat into my contractions. And I was starting to get worried at this point because I did not feel the baby descend the way that my last son descended. And I thought that that's what I needed to feel to know that he was coming down. And I just didn't feel it. And so at that point too, I had a friend that was a photographer that had shown up, and she had started snapping some shots. Now, I didn't really talk to her or anything, but I could hear that she was there. And I knew that the position I was in, I was like, we need to move positions because I don't think the baby's going to come down this way. And so I got onto my side. That was the side that I almost delivered my last son in. And that was the side that my other son had descended down. And so I got on my side and then again was able to like, I don't know if I just like instinctually flip on my back. I know a lot of women don't like to deliver on their back, or it's not like the best position, for a lot of people to deliver in, but that's just what I felt that I needed to do, I guess. So I turned over on my back, and they were like, do you want to see a mirror? Because we can see the baby's hair. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I couldn't even believe it that, he was coming already. Cause I had pushed for so long with my last son. And so I said, yes, I want to see. And so I was able to see him be born, and he came out. And he was placed right on my stomach. And I just remember that, I mean, it's only been 5 weeks. It's still pretty fresh in my head. I just remember that, like that warm, slippery, like feeling of the baby. It's just the best feeling in the world. I can't even describe it, but I just they're so warm and like, they just feel so good. And he came out and he was screaming. He was just screaming like crazy, and it was just it was such a relief. And I just remember that we were able to do the delayed cord clamping with him, which was something that I never got to do with any of my other children. And I was just able to have that skin to skin time with him for about 2 hours. And I just remember feeling like, oh my gosh, like this was perfect. And so we arrived at the hospital at 10:45 and he was born at 11:43.
Wow, that is fast.
Yeah. So, and my, contractions didn't really like start to get real crazy until around like 9:30 a.m. So it was pretty quick. Yeah. And we were able to have that time. And I delivered my placenta like beautifully. Like I had no issues this time delivering my placenta.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And they showed me my placenta, and it was like this, like a culmination of all the experiences to like have this one go, with all of the things that I couldn't have in the other births. It was really amazing. And so we had that time for about 2 hours. And then at 2 hours, I started having symptoms of bleeding, like of hemorrhaging. And I had another postpartum hemorrhage with him.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so I felt quickly just feeling like symptomatic, like I could feel like dizzy, and I was pretty familiar with that feeling at that point, and I knew something was wrong. And luckily they did get it under control pretty quickly, and I did not have to go to the operating room this time. But I did receive another blood transfusion because I had lost quite a bit of blood, and I have reddish hair. My whole family is redheads, and I don't know if you've ever heard this, that redheads just bleed.
No, I haven't.
In all my experiences, every time I go to the hospital and this happens to me, they're like, oh, you have red hair. And I'm like, I don't think there's any research to back that up, but that's what everyone says to me. And this time there was really no reasons why I bled, besides the only things that they can tell me is that there was like, it was a fast labor. And also I have big babies. So my first was 9'10", 9'9". My first was 9'10". My second was 9'9", and this Finn was 9 pounds 11 ounces.
Whoa.
Yeah. So they're all pretty big, and that's been an explanation that's given to me about just your uterus being tired and just having a hard time after birth to really contract down. I don't know. I feel like I've really come full circle in my birth journeys, and that I've just, to look at my first one and now this third one, like it's been a complete transformation and just how I trust my body and feel. But now this time it's been really hard processing all my issues surrounding the hemorrhages, because it's hard for me to understand why my body responds to birth in that way. And it's made me consider, think Finn is going to be our last child because of that, which makes me sad because I really want more children. But, at this point, I don't know, 3 for 3, that's like a high chance that it'll happen again.
Yeah, and without a good explanation, that's kind of scary.
Right. The first they kind of attributed to the Pitocin, and then the second they contributed to the retained placenta. And this time there was no explanation. So yeah, so those are my stories.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those. Do you have any, like, from your experiences, have you found any resources that you would recommend to pregnant or new moms?
Yeah, so of course The Business of Being Born, and I know it's been mentioned so many times on your show. I'd be surprised if anyone hasn't seen it, but more specifically those that are interested in having a VBAC, the More Business of Being Born, like the second video that they did, has like a segment about VBACs, which has a lot of information. I read Ina May's Guide to Childbirth during both my second and third pregnancy. I really felt like the birth stories were very helpful. Birthing from Within, that was helpful for me. And your podcast actually was really helpful for me in this last pregnancy.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, I mean, to listen to other women tell their birth stories it can be so powerful, because, all women have such different experiences, but they're also kind of the same in a way. We're all working so hard to bring these babies to the world. So yeah, it's been such a good resource. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for listening. And did you want to give the listeners a way to connect with you online?
You can follow me on Instagram. It's at Barb Demske.
Okay.
And that's mostly where I am. I also am actually a co-host to a podcast called the All Things Breastfeeding podcast.
Oh, awesome. Super related.
Yeah, so I co-host that. I also produce it, but the owner of the Breastfeeding Center of Ann Arbor, Barbara Robertson, she's the IBCLC and she's my mentor. So I do the podcast with her, and that's been a really cool experience. So you can listen to that for breastfeeding info. And I also have a blog that has kind of been quiet, but I do post about my family there, and that's Cultivating Motherhood.
Very cool. Well, I'll link to all of those on the show notes page so people can find it easily. And thanks again for taking the time tonight to share your birth stories.
Thank you so much. I really, really am excited to share with everyone.
Thanks again, Barbara. You can connect with Barbara by going to our show notes page, where we're going to link to her Instagram accounts. She has a new Instagram called First Latch, celebrating baby's first breastfeeding milestone. It's a really cute account. So you can find that. You can connect with me on Instagram at The Birth Hour. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, head to thebirthhour.com to sign up for our newsletter. And if you really like the show, please subscribe and leave a review in iTunes. I'm Bryn Hunt Palmer, and you've been listening to another episode of The Birth Hour. Thanks again, and see you next week.